The alarms on my ship were screaming before I even opened my eyes. I remember that moment clearly, because it was the last time in my long service that I ever felt truly certain of victory. My name is Vexthala Kor, and I am a veteran commander of the Threum Ascendancy. I stand before this tribunal not to defend myself, but to tell you the truth about what we found on that small blue world. Because if you do not listen, our people will make the same mistake again. Before that war, I had fought in 11 campaigns across 9 star systems. I had seen species surrender before our fleets even finished their first approach. I had seen entire governments collapse the moment our ships appeared in their skies. We were not cruel for the sake of cruelty. We were simply efficient. Resistance was rare, and when it happened, it never lasted more than a few days. This was the pattern of every conquest before Earth. This was the pattern we expected to repeat. When the scouting reports came back from the third planet of a yellow star system, most of us barely paid attention. The species there called themselves humans. Our analysts described them as short-lived, physically unremarkable, and biologically fragile, compared to almost every other species we had encountered. Their weapons were primitive by our standards. Their ships could barely leave their own solar system. On paper, they were nothing. I remember laughing when I read the summary. My second-in-command, an officer named Threll, joked that this campaign would be finished before our supply ships even caught up with us. I want you to understand that this was not arrogance without reason. We had data. We had history. We had won every single first contact conflict we had ever fought. There was no reason to believe humans would be any different. If anything, the reports suggested this would be the easiest campaign of my career. Our fleet entered their system with the same calm confidence we always carried. I stood on the command deck of my vessel, watching the blue and green planet grow larger on the display, and I felt nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a job that would soon be finished. We sent the standard message, offering their leadership one chance to submit peacefully. It was not a mercy born of kindness, it was simply protocol. Most species accepted immediately, understanding that resistance was pointless against a fleet like ours. The humans did not respond the way we expected. There was no immediate surrender, no panic, no desperate offers of negotiation. Instead, their communication channels went silent, and their surface defenses began moving into position, with a speed that surprised our tacticians. I remember Threll frowning at his display, muttering that perhaps their systems were simply slow to process our message. I did not think much of it at the time. I assumed it was confusion, not defiance. We began our first approach exactly as our doctrine required. Orbital assets were positioned. Ground forces were prepared. Everything followed the pattern that had worked for us countless times before. I gave the order to begin the operation, expecting the kind of quick, clean outcome I had witnessed so many times in the past. That expectation did not survive the first hour. Their ground forces did not scatter. They did not retreat toward their cities the way frightened defenders usually did. Instead, they organized themselves with a discipline that felt almost personal, as if they had been preparing for exactly this moment for their entire history. Our forward units reported unexpected losses within the first engagement, something that almost never happened this early in a campaign. I remember reading the reports twice, certain there had been some kind of error in the data. There was no error. I ordered a tactical pause, something I had rarely done in my career. I wanted to understand what we were actually facing before committing further resources. Our analysts began reviewing the engagement footage, and what they found unsettled even the most experienced officers among us. The humans were not simply fighting to survive. They were fighting with a kind of purpose that our models had never accounted for. When one position fell, another group moved to reinforce it without hesitation. When communication lines were cut, they adapted within minutes, using methods our systems had never seen before. Still, I told myself this was an anomaly. Every species had moments of unexpected resistance. I had seen it before, brief flashes of desperate courage that faded once the true scale of our forces became clear. I believed, with the confidence of someone who had never been proven wrong, that this resistance would collapse the moment we applied real pressure. I was wrong. The following days changed everything I thought I understood about warfare. Our fleet increased pressure exactly as doctrine demanded, expecting the human defense to weaken and eventually break. Instead, it seemed to grow sharper. Their tactics evolved with a speed that our own strategists struggled to predict. It was as if every setback taught them something new almost instantly, and they applied that lesson without hesitation the very next time we engaged them. One report in particular stayed with me long after that day. A group of human defenders, badly outnumbered and facing almost impossible odds, chose to hold their position rather than retreat. Our analysts expected them to surrender once their situation became clearly hopeless. They did not. They continued resisting until the very end of that engagement, coordinating with a calm precision that felt completely at odds with the desperate circumstances they were in. I remember standing in the command center, watching the data stream in, and feeling something I had not felt in a very long time. It was not fear exactly. It was closer to confusion, the uncomfortable sensation of watching something behave in a way that made no sense according to everything I had ever learned. Threll approached me during that period, his usual confidence noticeably shaken. He asked me plainly whether I believed our intelligence reports had been wrong. I did not have an answer for him then. All I knew was that the species we had expected to defeat easily was instead forcing us to reconsider strategies we had relied upon for generations. Our fleet commanders held a private discussion after the third day of engagement, something that almost never happened this early in a campaign. Several officers argued that we simply needed to increase the scale of our approach, applying more overwhelming force until the humans had no choice but to submit. Others, myself included, began to suspect that scale alone might not be enough. There was something different about how these people fought, something that had nothing to do with the strength of their weapons or the size of their forces. I remember one officer, a seasoned strategist named Doran, saying something that stayed with me for the rest of the war. He said that we had spent our entire history conquering species who fought to protect what they had, but these humans seemed to fight as if they had nothing left to lose, even when that clearly was not true. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. Later, I would understand it far better than I ever wanted to. By the end of that first week, our confident expectations of a swift and simple campaign had completely disappeared. What remained was a growing sense of unease among even our most experienced commanders. We had encountered many species before, some peaceful, some hostile, some technologically advanced, and others far behind us. But none of them had ever responded to overwhelming force the way humans did. I remember returning to my quarters that night, reviewing the reports one final time before attempting to rest. I found myself staring at a single line of data showing human morale readings, expecting to see the usual decline that came after significant losses. Instead, the numbers showed something our systems had never recorded before. Their determination was not weakening. If anything, it seemed to be increasing with every engagement. That was the moment I understood, for the first time, that we were not facing a simple conquest. We were facing something we did not yet understand, and in all my years of service, few realizations had ever unsettled me quite as deeply as that one. I closed my eyes that night with a question I had never needed to ask before in my entire career. What kind of species reacts to overwhelming force, not with fear, but with greater resolve? I did not have an answer yet, but I would soon learn, in ways I could never have imagined, exactly what kind of species we had chosen to underestimate. The second week of the campaign began with a decision that would change how I viewed this war forever. Our commanders decided to capture a small human outpost near the edge of a coastal region, believing that a controlled engagement would give us better insight into their tactics without risking a larger confrontation. I volunteered to lead the ground team myself, partly out of curiosity and partly because I no longer trusted the reports coming from a distance. I needed to see these humans with my own eyes. The outpost was smaller than expected, a modest structure surrounded by simple defensive barriers that looked almost primitive compared to our equipment. Our approach was swift and controlled, exactly as planned. Within minutes, we had secured the perimeter and moved inside, expecting minimal resistance given the size of the location. What we found instead was a handful of human defenders who continued resisting even after it became clear that their position could not be held. I remember one soldier in particular, a young man who introduced himself later as Daniel Hartley. He had been wounded during the engagement, yet he continued directing his remaining companions with a steady voice that showed no trace of panic. When we finally secured the outpost and took him into custody, I expected to see fear in his expression, the same fear I had witnessed in countless prisoners from other species throughout my career. Instead, I saw something closer to quiet defiance. as if being captured was simply another obstacle to overcome, rather than the end of his resistance. I ordered that he be taken aboard our ship for questioning, curious to understand the mindset of a species that fought the way his people did. During transport, despite being restrained and clearly outmatched, Daniel attempted to disable part of our transport systems using nothing more than basic tools he had managed to conceal. He did not succeed, but the attempt itself told me something important. Even in captivity, surrounded by forces far superior to his own, he refused to simply accept defeat. When I finally spoke with him directly, I asked why he continued resisting when the outcome seemed so clearly decided. His answer was simple, delivered without hesitation. He said that giving up was not something his people did easily, even when the odds were impossible. I remember studying his expression carefully, searching for any sign of exaggeration or performance, but found none. He genuinely believed what he was saying, and that belief unsettled me more than any weapon could have. Over the following days, similar patterns began appearing across multiple engagements throughout the campaign. Human casualties were rising steadily, yet instead of weakening their resolve, each loss seemed to strengthen their coordination. Our analysts struggled to explain this behavior using any of the models we had developed from previous conflicts. Every other species we had encountered eventually reached a breaking point, where continued resistance became psychologically impossible. Humans appeared to have no such limit, or if they did, we had not yet come close to finding it. I began reviewing historical records that our intelligence division had gathered about human civilization, hoping to understand where this behavior originated. What I found was a long and complicated history, filled with conflict, hardship, and repeated struggles for survival. Unlike many species we had previously encountered, humans had spent much of their history fighting difficult circumstances, both against each other and against the harsh conditions of their own world. It became clear that resilience was not something unusual for them. It was simply part of who they were. This realization troubled me deeply. We had assumed that a species without advanced technology would naturally lack the discipline and coordination needed to resist an organized military force. What we failed to understand was that technology was never the true measure of their strength. Their strength came from somewhere else entirely, something far more difficult to calculate or predict. During this period, I began noticing subtle changes in the attitudes of my own crew. Officers who had once approached this campaign with total confidence now spoke with noticeable caution. Conversations that used to focus on how quickly we would achieve victory now focused instead on how to avoid unnecessary losses. Threll, who had joked so casually before our arrival, rarely spoke about the campaign with humor anymore. The atmosphere aboard our fleet had shifted from confident anticipation to careful uncertainty. One evening, while reviewing reports from a recent engagement, I received word that a group of human civilians had been evacuated from a combat zone by their own military forces, even as those same forces were actively engaged in defending the area. This struck me as unusual. In most conflicts we had encountered, military priorities almost always outweighed civilian protection during active combat. Yet here, human forces consistently diverted resources to ensure their people reached safety, even when doing so placed their own defensive positions at greater risk. I asked Daniel about this during one of our conversations, curious whether this behavior was simply strategic or something deeper. He explained, with a calm certainty that surprised me, that protecting those who could not protect themselves was something his people valued deeply, regardless of the cost involved. I remember asking him whether this belief ever put his side at a disadvantage during conflict. He simply replied that some things mattered more than winning easily. That conversation stayed with me for a long time. In my experience, most species prioritize survival and strategic advantage above almost everything else during warfare. Humans seem to operate under a different set of principles, ones that occasionally worked against their own tactical interests, yet somehow never seemed to weaken their overall effectiveness. If anything, this willingness to protect their people, even at cost to themselves, appeared to strengthen the loyalty and determination of those fighting alongside them. As the days continued, our fleet commanders debated how to proceed. Some argued for an even greater show of force, believing that scale alone would eventually overwhelm any resistance, regardless of how determined it was. Others, myself included, began questioning whether raw power was truly the deciding factor in this conflict. I had seen overwhelming force fail to break their resolve time and time again. I was no longer confident that simply increasing our numbers would change that outcome. During one particularly difficult engagement near a mountainous region, our forces encountered a small group of human defenders who were significantly outnumbered and lacking adequate equipment compared to our own. According to every previous pattern we had observed across other species, surrender should have been the only reasonable outcome. Instead, this group managed to hold their position far longer than expected, using knowledge of their own terrain and quick improvisation to offset their disadvantage in technology. When I later reviewed the tactical reports from that engagement, I noticed something remarkable. Despite being under significant pressure, human forces coordinated flawlessly, adjusting their strategy in real time based on limited information. There was no panic in their communications, only calm instructions and rapid adaptation. It was as though their capacity to remain composed under extreme pressure was somehow built into who they were as a species. I began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that we had misjudged humanity in almost every possible way. We assumed weakness where there was resilience. We assumed simplicity where there was complexity. We assumed that a lack of advanced technology meant a lack of capability, when in truth, their greatest strength had nothing to do with the tools they carried into battle. One night, while reviewing yet another report describing unexpected human resistance, I found myself thinking about something Daniel had said during one of our earlier conversations. He told me that his people had faced difficult circumstances long before we ever arrived, and that our arrival, as dangerous as it was, did not change who they were at their core. At the time, I had dismissed this as simple bravado. Now, watching the pattern repeat itself across every engagement, I began to understand that he had been telling the truth. By the end of that second week, it had become clear to everyone in our fleet that this campaign would not follow the pattern we were used to. Humanity was not simply resisting out of desperation. They were resisting because resistance, in some fundamental way, was part of their identity as a species. This realization did not bring me comfort. If anything, it made me more cautious than I had ever been in any previous conflict. I remember standing on the observation deck of my ship that night, looking down at the blue and green world below us, and feeling a mixture of respect and unease that I had never experienced before during any campaign. We had entered this system expecting an easy victory against a primitive species. What we were beginning to understand instead was that we had encountered something far more complicated, something that would eventually force every single one of us to reconsider everything we believed about strength, resilience, and what it truly meant to be a formidable opponent. I did not yet know how much further this understanding would be tested. I only knew that the confidence we carried into this system had already begun to fade, replaced by a growing awareness that humanity was unlike anything we had ever faced before. There is one engagement from that war I will never forget, not because it was the largest battle we fought, but because it was the moment I stopped believing we could win this campaign through force alone. It happened near a settlement human forces called Ridgeline Outpost, a modest defensive position built along a range of hills overlooking a wide valley. According to every calculation our strategists had prepared, this position should have fallen within a single day. Instead, it held for nearly 3 weeks, and what happened there changed the way I understood warfare forever. I was given direct command of the operation, largely because my previous experience gathering intelligence on human resistance made me the most informed officer available. I approached this assignment with far more caution than I had shown during the earlier stages of the campaign. I no longer expected an easy victory. I expected difficulty, but even my adjusted expectations were not enough to prepare me for what we encountered. Our initial assault followed standard procedure, overwhelming firepower directed at their outer defenses, in an attempt to force a quick collapse. The outpost defenses were noticeably weaker than our own, exactly as our reports had suggested. Yet instead of collapsing under pressure, the human defenders adapted almost immediately. They abandoned indefensible positions without hesitation, falling back to prepared secondary locations that our scans had not fully detected. It became clear very quickly that they had anticipated exactly this kind of attack and prepared accordingly. What struck me most was not their equipment, which remained clearly inferior to ours, but their coordination. Every retreat was deliberate, every repositioning purposeful. There was no chaos in their movements, only calculated adjustments made in real time, based on our own actions. I remember reviewing communication intercepts from their forces during that first assault, expecting to hear panic or confusion. Instead, I heard calm instructions delivered with the same steady tone I recalled from my earlier conversations with Daniel Hartley. Over the following days, our forces attempted several different approaches, each one designed to exploit weaknesses that should have existed according to our analysis. Each time, human defenders adjusted their strategy before we could fully capitalize on any advantage. It was as though they were learning from every engagement almost instantly, refining their methods with a speed our own systems struggled to match. I remember a conversation I had with Threll during this period, standing together on the observation deck of our ship, watching reports come in from the ground forces below. He asked me directly whether I believed we could actually win this engagement through conventional methods. I did not have a confident answer for him. For the first time in my career, I genuinely did not know whether our strategy would succeed. As the days turned into weeks, the psychological toll on our own forces became increasingly apparent. Officers who had approached this campaign with total confidence now approached each new engagement with visible caution. There was a growing sense among our crew that we were facing something fundamentally different from anything we had encountered before, something that could not be measured simply through numbers or technological comparison. During one particularly intense night of fighting, our forces managed to breach a section of their outer defenses, creating what should have been a decisive advantage. Instead of exploiting this weakness immediately, our ground commanders reported something unusual. A small group of human defenders had positioned themselves specifically to delay our advance, fully aware that doing so would likely result in their own capture or worse. They held that position long enough for the rest of their forces to reorganize and prevent what would have otherwise been a complete collapse of their defense. I later learned that the officer who led that delaying action was a woman named Emma Ross. When she was eventually taken into custody after her position could no longer hold, I requested to speak with her directly, curious to understand the reasoning behind such a costly decision. Her answer was remarkably simple. She explained that sacrificing a small advantage to protect the larger group was not something she needed to think twice about. It was simply the responsible choice, given the circumstances they faced. I remember asking her whether she had been afraid, knowing the risk involved in her decision. She admitted that fear was present, but explained that fear alone had never been enough to stop her people from doing what needed to be done. There was no exaggeration in her voice, no attempt to appear more courageous than she truly felt. She spoke as though this kind of decision, difficult as it was, remained simply a normal part of her responsibilities. This pattern repeated itself throughout the entire siege of Ridgeline Outpost. Every time we believed we had found a decisive advantage, human forces responded with a combination of sacrifice, adaptation, and calm coordination that consistently prevented us from achieving the quick victory our doctrine promised. It became increasingly clear that we were not simply facing skilled fighters. We were facing a group of people who had built their entire approach to conflict around resilience under extreme pressure. Midway through the siege, our intelligence division intercepted a series of communications between the defenders and their broader command structure. These communications revealed something I found particularly striking. Despite significant losses and difficult conditions, morale among the defenders remained remarkably stable. There was no indication of the kind of psychological collapse we had witnessed in previous conflicts against other species facing similarly difficult circumstances. I began reviewing additional historical information about humanity during this period, hoping to better understand the origins of this behavior. What I found reinforced everything I had already begun to suspect. Human history was filled with periods of extreme hardship, conflict, and struggle, both against each other and against difficult circumstances beyond their control. Rather than breaking their resolve, this history seemed to have shaped a species that approached adversity as something expected, rather than something to be feared. One particular record stood out to me during this research. It described a period in human history where an entire population endured years of extraordinarily difficult circumstances, facing challenges that would have completely destroyed the will of most other species we had encountered. Rather than surrendering to despair, that population had continued functioning, adapting, and eventually recovering from circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome. Reading this record, I began to understand that what we were witnessing during the siege of Ridgeline Outpost was not an unusual exception. It was simply humanity behaving exactly as their history suggested they would. As the siege continued into its third week, our fleet commanders began debating whether continuing the assault was worth the increasing cost. Some argued that eventually, sheer attrition would force the defenders to collapse, regardless of their determination. Others, myself included, began questioning whether attrition alone would ever be enough against a species this resilient. I had seen overwhelming pressure fail to break their resolve too many times to believe that simply continuing the same approach would eventually succeed. During one of the final major engagements of the siege, our forces encountered a particularly determined group of defenders positioned near the center of the outpost. Despite being significantly outnumbered and facing clearly superior firepower, this group refused to withdraw, choosing instead to hold their position until reinforcements could arrive. I remember watching the tactical reports from that engagement, genuinely uncertain how it would end. When reinforcements finally arrived, they did so with a level of coordination that suggested careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. It was during this engagement that I first heard the name of a young officer named Lucas Bennett, who had organized the defense of that central position despite significant personal risk. When I later reviewed his tactical decisions, I found a level of composure and strategic thinking that would have impressed even our most experienced commanders. He had clearly understood that holding this position, even at great cost, was essential to preventing a complete collapse of their overall defense. By the time the siege of Ridgeline Outpost finally concluded, our forces had technically achieved a strategic objective, but the cost had been far higher than anyone had anticipated. More importantly, the confidence that had once defined our approach to this campaign had been completely replaced by a cautious respect for an opponent we no longer fully understood. I remember standing among the wreckage of that outpost afterward, looking at the remains of defenses that should never have held for as long as they did, and feeling a deep sense of unease about what this meant for the rest of the campaign. That night, I requested a private conversation with Emma Ross before she was transferred elsewhere. I asked her directly what had allowed her people to hold that position for so long against such difficult odds. Her answer was simple, yet it stayed with me for the remainder of the war. She said that her people had never needed easy circumstances to remain determined. They had simply learned, through generations of difficult experience, how to keep moving forward, even when every reasonable expectation suggested they should not be able to. I left that conversation with a growing understanding that this war would not be decided by technology or numbers alone. It would be decided by something far more difficult to measure, something rooted deeply in the history and character of the species we had chosen to underestimate. For the first time since arriving in this system, I genuinely began to wonder whether victory, in the way we had originally imagined it, was even possible against a people like this. After the siege of Ridgeline Outpost, I expected our fleet command to reconsider the entire approach of the campaign. Instead, they ordered an increase in operational scale, believing that greater force would finally overwhelm human resistance. I followed those orders because it was my duty, but I no longer carried the same certainty I once had. What happened next changed my understanding of humanity in ways I had never expected, and it began with an event I did not see coming. During a large-scale operation near a coastal region, my own transport vessel was severely damaged during an unexpected human counterattack. The vessel went down over unfamiliar territory, and I found myself stranded, along with a small group of surviving crew members, cut off from immediate support, and surrounded by the very people we had been fighting against. I remember the fear I felt in those first moments, not because I expected immediate harm, but because I genuinely did not know what to expect from a species whose behavior had already proven far more complex than anything in our previous experience. We were discovered within hours by a small human patrol operating in the area. I fully expected this encounter to end badly for my crew, given the circumstances of the ongoing conflict between our peoples. Instead, what happened surprised me more than almost anything else during that entire war. Rather than treating us purely as enemies to be eliminated, the patrol secured our group and provided immediate medical attention to those among us who had been injured during the crash. I remember watching one of their medics, a young woman named Grace Miller, treating injuries among my own crew, with the same careful attention she would likely give to her own people. I asked her directly why she was helping us, given everything that had happened between our species during this conflict. Her answer was simple, delivered without hesitation. She said that helping injured people, regardless of which side they were on, was simply the right thing to do. This response confused me deeply. In my experience, mercy during active conflict was rare, and when it existed, it was usually tied to some strategic advantage. I searched for a hidden motive behind her actions, some tactical reasoning that would explain this unexpected kindness. I found none. Her actions appeared to be exactly what she claimed them to be, a simple reflection of what she believed was right, regardless of the circumstances surrounding us. Over the following days, as negotiations began regarding the return of our stranded crew, I had the opportunity to observe human behavior in a way I never had before. I watched as their medical teams treated injured members of my crew with genuine care, ensuring that even those who had actively fought against them received proper treatment. I watched as ordinary soldiers, exhausted from weeks of difficult conflict, still found moments of kindness and humor, even in the middle of an ongoing war. I remember speaking with a soldier named Ethan Cole during this period, curious to understand how he reconciled the intensity of their resistance in battle with the compassion I was witnessing now. His explanation stayed with me for the rest of my life. He said that fighting fiercely to protect what mattered and treating others with basic decency were not contradictions. They were simply two sides of the same principle, the belief that life, both their own and others, deserved to be protected and respected whenever possible. This idea challenged everything I thought I understood about strength and conflict. In my experience, species that fought with such intensity typically lacked the capacity for genuine compassion toward their enemies. Humans, however, seemed to carry both qualities simultaneously, without one diminishing the other. Their determination in battle did not make them cruel, and their compassion did not make them weak. If anything, these two qualities together made them far more formidable than either quality alone could have. During my time among them, I also witnessed something I found particularly striking. Despite the ongoing conflict, human forces maintained careful distinctions between combatants and those who were not directly involved in the fighting. I remember overhearing a conversation between two officers discussing plans for an upcoming operation, specifically emphasizing the importance of minimizing harm to those not directly involved in the conflict. This was not simply strategic calculation. It reflected a genuine principle that seemed deeply embedded in how they approached warfare as a whole. One evening, while still awaiting resolution regarding our return, I found myself in conversation with an older officer named Henry Whitfield, who had been overseeing our temporary custody. I asked him directly whether he ever felt conflicted about showing kindness toward those actively fighting against his people. His response was thoughtful and measured. He explained that abandoning basic decency simply because circumstances were difficult would mean losing something far more important than any single battle. He said that maintaining their principles, even during conflict, was part of what made the effort to protect their people worthwhile in the first place. I began to understand, through these conversations and observations, that humanity's approach to conflict was built upon a foundation far more complex than simple survival instinct. Their willingness to fight fiercely was matched by an equally strong commitment to certain principles that guided their behavior even when circumstances made those principles difficult to maintain. This combination created something our previous experience with other species had never fully prepared us for. During my time stranded among human forces, I also witnessed moments of genuine connection that further challenged my previous assumptions. I remember watching Grace Miller share a quiet conversation with one of my own crew members, someone who had initially approached the entire situation with clear hostility. By the end of their conversation, that same crew member appeared visibly less tense, having found unexpected common ground with someone technically considered an enemy. These small moments of connection occurred more frequently than I would have expected, gradually reshaping how many members of my own crew viewed the humans holding us. Eventually, arrangements were made for our safe return through a temporary agreement between our commanding forces. Before we departed, Grace approached me directly, offering a final piece of medical supplies for the journey ahead, despite having no obligation to do so. I remember asking her one final question before we parted ways. I asked her whether she believed peace between our species was truly possible, given everything that had happened during this conflict. She considered the question carefully before answering. She said that peace was always possible, as long as both sides remained willing to see each other as more than just enemies. That conversation stayed with me long after we returned to our fleet. I found myself unable to view humanity through the same lens I had used before this experience. They were not simply fierce warriors, nor were they simply compassionate individuals caught in circumstances beyond their control. They were something far more complicated, a species capable of holding both intensity and kindness together without contradiction. This realization troubled me deeply, because it meant that everything our doctrine had taught us about conquest and resistance no longer applied in any meaningful way to the people we were fighting. Upon my return, I reported everything I had witnessed to our fleet command, fully expecting skepticism regarding my observations. Instead, similar reports had already begun arriving from other officers who had experienced comparable situations during the ongoing campaign. It became clear that my experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern that our entire fleet was beginning to recognize. I remember one particular meeting among senior officers where this new understanding was openly discussed for the first time. Several commanders expressed genuine uncertainty about how to proceed against an opponent who combined such fierce resistance with unexpected compassion. Our previous strategies had been built entirely around assumptions that no longer seemed accurate. If humanity's strength came not simply from tactical skill, but from a deeper combination of resilience and principle, then our approach to this entire conflict needed serious reconsideration. I left that meeting with a growing sense that we had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the species we had chosen to confront. We had assumed that primitive technology meant a primitive understanding of conflict and morality. Instead, we had encountered a people whose approach to both warfare and compassion was more sophisticated than anything in our previous experience, despite lacking the technological advantages we possessed. That night, reflecting on everything I had witnessed during my time stranded among human forces, I found myself questioning many of the assumptions that had guided my entire career. If strength and compassion could exist together, so naturally within a single species, then perhaps our understanding of what made an opponent truly formidable had been incomplete all along. Humanity had shown me something I had never encountered before in all my years of service, and I knew, even then, that this realization would shape everything that happened for the remainder of this war. I stand before this tribunal today, not as the confident officer who once laughed at reports describing a fragile, primitive species. I stand here as someone whose entire understanding of strength, conflict, and character was permanently reshaped by what I witnessed during that campaign. The war against humanity did not end in the swift conquest our doctrine promised. It ended in something none of us had prepared for. A negotiated peace, between equals, reached only after we finally understood exactly what kind of species we had chosen to underestimate. In the final months of the conflict, after countless engagements that defied every expectation we once held, our fleet command made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable at the beginning of this campaign. Rather than continuing to pursue victory through overwhelming force, senior officers began exploring the possibility of negotiation. This decision did not come from weakness. It came from a growing understanding that continued conflict would only lead to greater losses on both sides, without any guarantee of the outcome we had originally sought. I was among the officers selected to participate in early discussions surrounding this potential resolution, largely because of my direct experience among human forces during my earlier time stranded on their territory. I remember entering those discussions with a mixture of caution and genuine curiosity, uncertain how a species capable of such fierce resistance would approach the possibility of peace. What I encountered during those negotiations surprised me once again. Human representatives approached the discussions with the same combination of determination and principle I had witnessed throughout the entire conflict. They were firm in protecting the interests of their people, yet consistently demonstrated a genuine willingness to understand our perspective as well. There was no attempt to humiliate us, despite the significant losses we had suffered throughout the campaign. Instead, their approach focused on establishing a foundation for lasting peace, rather than simply securing temporary advantage. During one particular session, I found myself speaking directly with a human negotiator named Olivia Bennett, who approached every discussion with remarkable clarity and fairness. I remember asking her why her people seemed so willing to pursue peaceful resolution, despite having demonstrated such capability in resisting our forces throughout the war. Her answer, much like the answers I had received from soldiers and medics earlier in the conflict, reflected a consistency in principle that I had come to recognize as fundamentally human. She explained that strength was never meant to be used purely for domination. True strength, she said, was measured by the wisdom to know when continued conflict served no meaningful purpose. This philosophy, consistent across every human I had encountered throughout the war, stood in stark contrast to everything our own doctrine had taught us about conquest and victory. We had always measured success purely through territorial control and submission of opposing forces. Humanity measured success differently, valuing long-term stability and mutual respect over simple domination. This difference in perspective, more than any single battle or engagement, ultimately shaped the final outcome of our conflict. As negotiations continued, I began reflecting deeply on everything I had witnessed since our fleet first arrived in this system. I thought about Daniel Hartley, who continued resisting even after capture, refusing to accept defeat despite overwhelming odds. I thought about Emma Ross, who sacrificed a tactical advantage to protect the larger group she was responsible for. I thought about Lucas Bennett, whose calm leadership held together a defense that should have collapsed long before it did. I thought about Grace Miller, whose compassion extended even to those actively fighting against her people. Each of these individuals represented a different aspect of the same underlying truth, a truth I had been slow to fully understand. Humanity's strength was never simply about weapons or technology. It was about an unshakable combination of resilience, principle, and compassion that allowed them to fight fiercely when necessary, while still maintaining their humanity, even in the middle of devastating conflict. This combination made them far more dangerous than any technologically superior opponent I had ever encountered, precisely because it could not be measured or predicted using our previous frameworks of understanding. By the time formal peace was finally established between our peoples, both sides had suffered significant losses throughout the campaign. Yet rather than fostering lasting resentment, the resolution reached during those negotiations laid the foundation for a relationship built on mutual respect rather than domination. I remember standing among representatives from both our peoples during the final signing of that agreement, feeling a strange mixture of relief and quiet humility that I had never expected to feel at the conclusion of any military campaign. In the years that followed, humanity's influence expanded significantly beyond their own solar system, eventually becoming recognized as one of the most respected and, in some ways, most cautiously regarded powers among the wider galactic community. Species who had once dismissed them as primitive, much as we once had, quickly learned to reconsider that assessment after witnessing the same qualities I had personally observed during our conflict. Their reputation was not built purely on military capability, but on a consistent demonstration of resilience, combined with genuine principle, a combination that continued to define their interactions with other civilizations long after our war had ended. I often reflect on Doran's words from early in the campaign, when he suggested that humans fought as if they had nothing left to lose, even when that clearly was not true. I understand now what he meant, far more deeply than I did at the time. Humanity did not fight from desperation alone. They fought because their history had taught them that giving up, even in the face of impossible circumstances, was simply not part of who they were. That same history had also taught them the value of compassion, even toward those who sought to harm them, creating a species capable of extraordinary resilience without losing the principles that made that resilience meaningful. When I consider everything I witnessed throughout that campaign, from the earliest overconfident briefings to the final moments of negotiated peace, I recognize now that our greatest mistake was never underestimating human technology. Our greatest mistake was underestimating human character, a mistake that cost us far more than any measure of military strength ever could. I offer this testimony today as both a warning and a lesson for anyone who might one day consider a similar campaign against a species whose history remains unfamiliar to us. Do not assume that a short history free of major interstellar conflict means a lack of resilience. Do not assume that the absence of advanced technology means an absence of formidable capability. And most importantly, never assume that compassion, shown by an opponent, reflects weakness rather than genuine strength. Humanity taught me, through countless difficult lessons throughout that campaign, that the most dangerous opponents are not always those with the greatest technological advantage. Sometimes, the most formidable opponents are those who combine unbreakable resilience with unwavering principle, refusing to lose themselves even in the middle of devastating conflict. This combination, more than any weapon or strategy, defined humanity throughout our war, and it remains, to this day, the single most important lesson I carry from my entire career of service. If this tribunal takes nothing else from my testimony, Let it take this single truth. We entered that system expecting to encounter a simple, primitive species, easily brought under our control. Instead, we encountered a people whose strength came not from what they possessed, but from who they fundamentally were. That distinction, more than anything else, decided the outcome of our war, and it remains, even now, the greatest lesson humanity ever taught me. This concludes my testimony.